Welcome back to Obscurus Gaming, and today I'm going through the full catalog of digital board games for the Nintendo Switch. To clarify, these are tabletop games that became so popular that they later got a digital version for the Switch, with a sprinkling of a couple where the tabletop version came after the video game, and I'll be sure to point those out when we come across them. And to further clarify, these are not video games that are simply inspired by board game mechanics, so games like obviously Mario Party, for example, would not make this list. So yeah, let's take a look from A to Z at all the digital board games you can play on the Nintendo Switch. First up is 8-Minute Empire Complete Edition, a game I have not played myself, but by all accounts the digital version does a good job of mimicking the board game. The game lends itself to some pick up and play mechanics as kind of a quick and easy to learn area control style game for up to 5 players both locally and online. Next up here is Battleship, a game that really needs no introduction. I don't have much to say here other than I haven't played the Switch version, but it is kind of wild that the original Battleship came out in 1931, so we are going almost 100 years since the original, and the game is still somewhat relevant. The Switch version has online and local play, and does introduce a few non-traditional things to the Battleship experience. Up next is Calico, a game I just reviewed for this channel, so I'll link to that here. It's a tile-laying puzzle game that is one of the most popular family games of the last decade. The digital version is also really good, and you can check out my full review of the game here. Carcassonne is another game that really shouldn't need an introduction, at least for anyone that's branched out even a little bit with their board game collection. There have been several digital versions of the game over the years, and the Switch is no exception. Online is not here, but you can play locally for up to 6 players. Next up is the other famous letter C board game, and that is Catan, formerly known as Settlers of Catan. Although I have not played the Switch version of the game, Catan is one of the most influential tile-laying board games of all time, so if you enjoy it, you might also enjoy playing the digital version on the go, especially with online play included with the Switch version. Charterstone is a newish strategy campaign style game for up to 6 players, and the Switch version actually has online as well. If you've never played a campaign style board game, it basically just means that every time you play another game, it builds upon the previous game that you played, and often there's a story kind of linking everything together. The board game is fun, but the digital version here has some very mixed reviews, with the big theme being not to pick it up unless you're already familiar with the original. Next up here is kind of a weird one, and that's Clubhouse Games 51 Worldwide Classics, published by Nintendo themselves. Within this package are several classic board games like Othello and chess, to name a couple, and there's really a ton of others. I never had much interest in picking this up, but it seems to have good value considering everything that's included here. Next up here is Clue, one of the classic Hasbro games. It's one of the better ones that we have all played as kids. I have not played the digital Switch version, but from what I can tell, it does an adequate job of recreating the tabletop experience. By the way, if you don't know what the BGG rank means on all these slides, it is the Board Game Geek all-time ranking of the best board games ever made. So the smaller the number, the better game is considered among the most popular board game communities. Which brings me to Concordia, ranked in the top 25 of the best tabletop board games ever made. It's a Euro-style strategy game for up to 6 players where you basically just attempt to build up your empire. It's a sizable step up in fun and difficulty from games like Risk, but if you're willing to learn how to play it, it again is one of the best board games ever made. I really wasn't sure if I should put Dorfromantik on this list because the board game came out after the video game, but they did such a good job with it that I do feel inclined to add it here. It's a single player tile laying game, at least the video game is, where you try to build landscapes and villages to get a high score. The board game then adapted this mechanic naturally, and it got some pretty good reviews when it came out a couple of years ago. The Dresden Files is a cooperative card game based on a series of novels of the same name. In the video game version, each player is a character from the novel and you solve cases together. It sounds pretty cool and a little different from a lot of games on this list. Up next is Everdell, and it's personally one of my favorite board games of all time. It's kind of a worker placement card tableau building game where you try to build up a village of critters and buildings. It has an awesome table presence with a 3D tree and can be enjoyed by pretty much anyone. Now, the Switch version did not get a ton of love, so I think this is an example of a game that is best enjoyed as a tabletop or board game only, and the digital version is not a necessity, but I'm still happy to see it here on the console. Next up is Evolution, a cool little board game where you compete against other players to adapt your species to a changing environment. I haven't played it, but it is on my wish list, and with online matchmaking is something that might have a ton of value. The expansion to Evolution called Climate is also available on console as well. Yep, you can play the digital version of Life. I think some kids might enjoy the simplicity of the experience, but other than that, it's something you should probably skip, again, unless you're playing with a younger audience. And the complete opposite of that, up next is Gloomhaven, which some people might argue is the best board game of all time. It is currently ranked 4th on Board Game Geek, which is kind of insane. Gloomhaven is an extremely deep tabletop RPG game that we could talk about for a while. So having a digital version you can play on your own without having to learn all the setup and rules is a nice option. Istanbul Digital Edition is also considered one of the best board games of all time, but I unfortunately have never played it myself. The Switch version is the official adaptation of the board game and includes online multiplayer and cross-platform play. Machi Koro is a relatively accessible city building game that can be enjoyed by kids and adults alike. The game looks pretty nice on console, so if you don't have the board game version or can't get everyone to play the tabletop game, then you might have a little better luck with the digital adaptation of it. And up next is Monopoly, and for better and mostly worse, the most popular board game of all time is here on Switch. There's pretty much been a digital version of Monopoly on every console you could possibly think of, and the Switch is no exception. Another game that we can move quickly through but exists is Mousetrap. Again, probably can only really be enjoyed by a younger audience, so this, along with Life and a couple others on this list, all fit that category, but I don't really have a ton to say about it. Switching gears kind of significantly to our next game, and that's Mystic Vale, a strategic deck building game where each player takes the role of a clan trying to eliminate various curses. The catch with Mystic Vale is a feature called a card crafting system where you can build up individual parts of the card, a mechanic I've never really seen before in a digital game or a board game either. Next up is One Deck Dungeon. It's also a unique card game that is actually a roguelike experience. Because of this and the dungeon and monster theme throughout, I think it was relatively easy to adapt a digital version of the game, and the Switch version seems to be decent enough. Overboss is an interesting little tile game that manages to combine a monster theme with the tile laying experience. The digital version seems to embrace a more pixel art style, something that is a little bit different and pretty unique to this list, so I kind of dig the look of it, even if I haven't played the board game or digital version myself. Next up is Pandemic, one of the most popular cooperative board games of all time. I'm including it here because some people may have played it, but the game was actually removed from the eShop back in 2022, and you can only play it, I think it's on Board Game Arena now, so moving on to the next one. Raiders of the North Sea is another board game that sits around the top 100 ever made. The game combines strategy and worker placement mechanics, and is a game I've always been somewhat interested in. The Switch version is relatively well received, so I think it is one of the better options on this list for anyone looking for a game with more depth. Next up is Risk, the classic strategy game that's been around since the 1950s and again has seen a ton of digital adaptations over the years. If you've made it this far down the video, it is pretty much a guarantee you know what Risk is already. Moving on to another 4-letter R game, and that's Root, one of the best board games released in the last decade. Root is kind of a cozy war game, if that makes sense, where each player fights for control of the forest. The game has pretty much universal praise, and the digital version does a good job of recreating the tabletop experience. Up next is Sagrada, which personally is actually one of my favorite board games. It plays more like an advanced version of Yahtzee in some ways, where you're rolling dice and placing them on a window to form color and numeric patterns. It's actually like the one game I have on my cell phone, so I don't own the Switch version, but it is one of my favorite board games and it looks great here too. Next up is Scout, which is part of a digital package called Let's Play Oink Games. I know that sounds a little weird, but Oink Games is the name of one of the best card game companies going today, and Scout is just one of 7 different games in this Switch version. Scout itself has managed to sneak into the top 100 board games or card games ever made, so if you haven't checked it out yet, I strongly recommend it. Next up is Slay the Spire, which quite honestly is a genre-defining video game that needs no introduction. Because of its popularity, a board game was created just this past year to pretty much equal praise. I know technically this shouldn't be on this list because the board game came well after the video game, but it did such a cool job of recreating the Slay the Spire experience that I had to include it here. So like Slay the Spire, Stardew Valley is another video game that led to the creation of a pretty decent board game, which I know is the opposite of the games on this list. But I am including it here because it looks great and is extremely thematic if you are a fan of the video game. Stone Age is one of the most famous worker placement games of all time, where you balance developing a tribe and then feeding them. It's decently accessible from what I can tell, and the Switch digital version, from what I've read, mimics the board game pretty well. Talisman, which I hope I'm saying that right, is a classic fantasy adventure game that has been around since the 80s, and the Switch version of the officially licensed digital version is here. I don't have much personal interest in playing it, but it is one of the more popular fantasy board games out there and warrants a spot on this list. This is the last time I'm doing it for this list, but This War of Mine is a very dark survival game that focuses on civilians trying to get by and scrap by during a war, and it led to the release of a board game version, which initially seemed kind of random, but the board game is incredibly well done. So much so that I wanted to make note of it here, and it's definitely a game you should consider picking up if you like story-based board games. Up next is the most popular modern board game of all time, and that's Ticket to Ride. The game saw its latest digital version released just last year, and all the various map expansions are coming as DLC if they haven't already over the next few months. I have the digital version and it's a bit choppy with some bugs, but it is a fun way to play the game when I don't want to set it up or have anyone to play against. And also a cool little feature of the Switch version is that anyone can use their cell phone to play along, which is kind of nice when you have a group of 3, 4, 5, or even 6 players playing locally. Up next is Trivial Pursuit, which has been around for a while and continues to see digital versions made, and the Switch again is no different. I don't really have any interest in picking this up, but just know it exists on console. Outside of like poker or something, Uno is probably the most popular card game ever made. When playing the digital version, it is a relatively mindless way to pass the time, but with so many other board and card games even on this list, you can probably skip picking this one up, and if you want to play Uno, I would probably actually recommend that on a cell phone or something like that. And to round up this list in a very last but not least scenario is probably my favorite digital board game on the Switch, and that's Wingspan, a game I reviewed a couple years ago, so I'll link to that here. It's quite honestly a gorgeous adaptation of the board game and really elevates it even further. And honestly, it's also kind of one of the most peaceful games you can play on console. It's a must-have for really any Switch or board game fan, and one I still play all the time, especially considering it does have online and cross-platform capabilities to keep it going. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, guys. If I missed any board games that have a digital version, please let me know in the comments below. But I think I got most, if not all of them. But just in case anyone stumbles upon this video, I'll pin those to the top, and we'll catch you next time.